Hi everybody. I'm just gonna put this out there. I've been sick for the last 2 weeks, so I do apologize for being kind of off my game and having my nose and everything else kind of stuffy. My brain is not operating at 100%. But for my final project, I went ahead and I chose the topic of the U.S. criminal justice system, and this particular issue is it's interesting because I actually started and I'm ending the HR curriculum researching the same issue. And so the very first class that I took for the HR degree was Current Problems in HR, and we had to read a book by Michelle Alexander, and it's the New Jim Crow Laws, and it was titled Mass Incarnation in the Age of Colorblindness. And so at the very beginning of the course, I took a stance pretty much ignoring all the facts and everything that she had brought up, and I was very limited in my view, and I couldn't really see the points that the author was trying to bring up, just because I was so set in stone that, I, as being a white female, was not privileged, and that I did feel that, at the time I was like, racism doesn't exist, it's the 21st century, blah, blah, blah. And so now I've done a completely 180, and so to me it's just interesting to know that I started and now I'm ending the course on the exact same topic, and I have a completely different view after going through the curriculum and learning all the courses, and then especially ending with this diversity class as well. So with that, I'm going to move you guys over here. I really hope this doesn't turn me off. Still good to go? I think so. Okay. So if you move to slide 2 of my presentation, I kind of go over some core problems of the current criminal justice system. And I wish this graph would be bigger, but if y'all screens, if you want to bring it up onto the full screen, that would be better. But there's a couple different issues. And first is, so in the U.S., the incarceration rate has significantly doubled, and is continued. You'll see this continued trend upward. And if you look at the graph on the left, all the other countries, their incarceration rates kind of remain the same for the last 30 years, where the U.S. has significantly increased and continues to move up to the right. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but what kind of sparked it was the war on drugs, and I'm going to get into later how that is targets minorities, and there's been racial disparities, as you can see on the graph on the right side of of slide 2, where if you were born white or black, that definitely has a huge impact depending on your risk or your odds of being incarcerated for a variety of different crimes. So moving on to slide 3, there's other issues with there's other consequences of the current criminal justice system, and those include health factors. So you not only have to look at the health factors of the person or the individual being incarcerated, but you also have to take into consideration their family. So say the male figure of the family is incarcerated, that family is most likely not going to be able to provide adequately for the families to get them the health care and the food and everything they need. And the education and the awareness of these health issues for them is also limited. And so it also cripples entire communities. And what I mean by this is, so now you have the male figure or whatnot of that family, and they're incarcerated. So now the family is now going to have to support themselves by some other means. And so that just leads to even more crimes, and then more people will be taken out of those communities, and pretty much limiting and almost destroying entire communities. After you are incarcerated, your chances of getting any type of job significantly decrease. And then also another problem that we have is there's currently no post-incarceration program. And if there are, they're extremely limited. So, and I'll get into it later, but the government spends, billions of dollars focusing on putting these people into prison, but they don't spend a fraction of that on alternatives. And if you move to slide 4, this actually went through our textbook, and it shows you like the pro and the cons of the current judicial system. And this is going to further explain the current problems that I just introduced in the previous slides. So if you look on the pro side, some argued that the current system is strict enough, and that the rich and the powerful should, instead of focusing on petty crimes, the rich and the powerful should actually be targeted, because in the textbook it had stated that it had went into detail about sorry, let me get my thoughts here. So street crimes equal about $17.6 billion every year. But all the white-collar crimes, when you add those together, so these are led by your most powerful and privileged individuals in the country. So you have to look at the health industry, pollution, unsafe consumer products. You have to look at working conditions and fraud. And all those white-collar crimes, those actually equal $486 billion a year, which is actually 28 times more than the street crimes. However, the rich and the powerful are always usually let off the hook. And then if you go into the next box, I say that we're harsher, that with the current system, they're very harsh on petty crimes. And the book also talks about this ideal called the broken windows. So when you have a community, the idea behind being harsher on petty crimes or breaking into windows and cars is to defer them from wanting to commit harsher crimes. So the theory is it's a physical disorder that leads to social disorder and then criminal evasions. So the police do not reduce the crime. The police try and reduce the crime so that it ends up not escalating further on. Also, the argument for the pro was that the majority of cops are indeed inherently good, and they are trying to, just stick up for the laws and regulations that they're there to uphold. And then they also, one suggestion would be to completely outlaw drug use, because as you can see on the graphs before, the incarceration rates dramatically increased when the war on drugs started back in with the Clinton administration, and he said that he was going to focus on crime, but what it did is it actually limited entire races. Because if you look at the kind of drugs that African Americans are using versus whites, the laws are set in place to be harsher on the cocaine and those sorts of drugs that are typically associated with African Americans or Hispanics or Mexicans. So against going into the con section, there are definitely racial biases with the current system. Again, they're overzealously policing those petty crimes, and there's also a lack of rehabilitation systems. But what I found was very interesting with both articles is there is some type of middle ground that can be found, and in both of them, they're not saying that the judicial system is perfect. They're saying they both could agree that it needs to be reformed. Excuse me. and that we need to find alternatives to incarceration. And similar to like legalizing weapons and that kind of thing, I thought it was interesting that most of your European countries have legalized drugs just because you can go back to looking at the basic rights of humans. Should the government be allowed to tell us what we can and can't put into our bodies? And so that could go into a whole nother issue. But moving on, if you scroll down to slide 5. Excuse me. So one of the questions had asked, is the criminal justice system, is it a diversity, and how does it relate to the concepts in the course that we have been taking? And I said that it definitely is a diversity issue, because as I mentioned before, if you look at the drug laws, they're almost racist in themselves. So your African American, they are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than a white male. So that in itself should be looked at. Again, all the minorities are being targeted. There's a more heavy emphasis on street crime than there are the white collar crimes, and I don't know the exact statistics, but so you go to prison for doing drugs or something, you will be incarcerated much longer than, say, a CEO of a billion-dollar company who committed some type of fraud. They're normally just let off the hook. And then so if the population imprisoned, it would drop by 40% if minorities were incarcerated at the same rate as whites. Moving on to slide 6, we discussed the dominant versus the subordinate group. So with this particular issue, obviously the white majority is the dominant. The laws favor them. And then Michelle Alexander talks about this age of colorblindness, where we pretty much just redefined discrimination and we've legalized it differently. It's not, advert calling people names and stuff, but within the laws and everything that we have set up for ourselves, that atmosphere still exists, and there is still racism and discrimination. So then on the flip side, you'll have your minorities, which are your African Americans and Mexicans, and they have limited power and resources. Again, this kind of correlates to the previous slide, but your power elements and then the resources at stake. So obviously, the white majority, there's going to be power inequalities there. If you have the resources and the money to argue a certain case, then that is going to go way further than if you don't have any backing or money to support your argument. We looked into employment opportunities, and then again, whole communities being at risk, and then this idea called centrification. And basically, what happens is, so companies will go out and place their manufacturing or their plants into very low-income residencies, and typically the low-income residencies are populated by your Mexicans or your African Americans. And so what happens is they slowly start pushing those individuals out by putting their plants there and everything. And then as the area builds up, those minorities are no longer afford to live in those kind of communities, and so they're left homeless, or they're left to move somewhere else. And so the definition is just pushing minorities out and bringing in the white people that have more money, and they do this by increasing the cost of living. So I decided to use the NAACP as my champion organization, because honestly I didn't know too much about them. I wanted to do further research and figure out how they're helping all of the civil rights movements. And what I found was extremely significant. One interesting fact is that So it's the National Association of Advancement of Colored People, in case anyone did not understand that. And what I thought was really cool is their leadership is actually biracial. So in the beginning, when it was founded in 1909, it's a biracial activist group. So the members are not just African American. And so their mission is to ensure political and educational, social and economic equality of rights of all persons and to eliminate race-based discrimination. Excuse me. And I'll go into it later, but some of their top movements are going to be in the educational, income equality, voter rights, and then also, lastly, the criminal justice system. And so they are basically legal advocates for all civil rights issues. Okay, so what did they do? They highlight these issues and their problems. They bring them to the forefront. So when we're specifically looking at the justice system, some of the things that they've done to advocate a new reform is they were able to get President Obama's approval and support for a roadmap to reform the entire justice system, and that is still in the workings. Another big thing they were able to do is called the Sentencing Act of 2015, and that is it's in the status of order reported, and so they're waiting on the Senate for approval. But basically, this act is going to reform the justice system as well, and they have the whole recommendation and everything and tools on how they feel that it should be fixed. And then one thing that I will add that President Obama had said is he said, mass incarceration makes our country worse off, and we need to do something about it. And as I mentioned earlier, he said that the U.S. spends over $80 billion a year on incarceration, and as opposed to some of the alternatives that we could be looking at in order to help our country as a whole and make it healthier. And then you can go onto their website, and they have tons of different articles on how to, better the system and help advocate it, become like a member and everything. So there's a lot of interesting tools and things on their actual page. Okay, so moving down to slide 10, some of the best practices that they have employed was, if going back in time, they've been key activists in every single civil rights success. So they've had constant support. If you look at the Morgan versus Virginia, which is a segregation in public transportation, they helped win the Brown versus Board of Education. They helped sign the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then one thing that I want to bring up is, what is hindering their success as an organization in order to bring these issues to the forefront and actually see, their plans and their practices come to fruition. And what I had to realize is that because they're a minority group, the majority is always going to fail to recognize that there is discrimination or there is even a problem. And this is something that I can relate to because a couple of years ago I was pretty much in the same boat. And so when you actually become aware of these issues, and there's one quote that I always like to use, and it says that privilege is invisible to those who have it. So when this type of organization is coming to the forefront and asking the majority for support, they're most likely not going to be able to receive it simply because the majority of Americans are blind to it, and they do not want to see that as an actual issue. And they also feel, or some of the leaders in power also feel that equality is almost seen as losing some of their power, when in reality it would actually help the country become more successful. And so that the majority and the people in power currently are so focused on keeping the power in that we're actually losing the power to outside sources, whether that's jobs or people taking bits and pieces of the country. So, in conclusion, again, I just want to say that this topic definitely hits home for me, and I know I haven't articulated it the best just because my brain is not where it should be. But I hope that you still can go back and look at some of the details and the resources that I have laid out in this presentation. And I'm hoping to do some more research and figure out how I can advocate for these issues and help the other organizations, and including the NAACP, to gain the traction that is needed to address these issues. And then you can see some of my resources below on the next slide. But thank you for your time. I hope you were able to gain a little bit from this. And again, I do apologize for not being fully intact. Thank you.